Our gospel for this evening of Maundy Thursday comes to us from John, the 13th chapter. Now before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You do not know what I am doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you will have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not only my feet, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "One who has bathed does not need to wash, except for the feet, but is entirely clean, and you are clean, though not all of you." For he knew who was to betray him. For this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." After he had washed their feet, had put on his robe, and had returned to the table, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for this is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example, that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, servants are not greater than their masters, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. Now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am only with you a little longer. You will look for me, and as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated. Would you join with me in prayer? O Lord, may the meditations of my heart and the words of my mouth be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. We make the assumption that the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, are all speaking of the same event when they gather together for this Passover meal. Whereas John remembers vividly a foot washing, the rest of the gospels and Paul following him remember a final meal, gathered together with bread and wine. And of course, it was a Passover meal. It was a meal that was set into tradition, recalling the mighty acts of God, using, very importantly, unleavened bread. Because in the time of the Exodus away from the Egyptians, there was no time for leavening to be added to the bread. Therefore, year after year in the Passover story, we remember it with a wafer-thin, cracker-like bread, which, transmitted through the church year and through many different iterations, has become the communion wafer in the idea of many churches. Thank God I got us to stop using communion wafers. They are dry, they are stale, they are so hard to eat. If anyone has ever eaten what we have at Passover, it tastes nothing like that. It's styrofoam. Somehow they managed to include gluten, I think just to exclude people who have celiac disease, because there's no possible other reason for putting that in there. It's a terrible thing. However, its historical precedent is actually a lot cooler than what we have received in these terrible little wafers. Back in the Middle Ages, there was a device that became very popular for wafer making. And, well, let's have a look. This is not it. But this is close to what it would have looked like. This is a tortilla press, okay? And many people would say we have the tortilla press today because of this wafer creation design. But it would be very much like this. Now here you got to use your imaginations. You have to think to yourself, what would happen if you inlaid, instead of this smooth surface here, What if you inlaid this with whatever Bible passage, whatever Bible story you wanted? You could put on every week's communion wafers a little bit of the story that was about to be read. How cool is that? You could have something for the season, for the day. It could be about the Virgin Mary, which puts a whole new take on seeing the Virgin Mary in the tortilla. Not quite as crazy as it sounds now, okay? The idea behind this was that you could make a wafer out of this thing, and slowly but surely, it caught on in a big way. And this was very popular throughout France, very popular in Italy. It became so popular that people would jockey to try to get the coolest wafers, and eventually, like all the cool stuff that we do as a church, it ends up leaving the walls of the building. And the word wafer turns into waffle. I kid you not. This is actual true history. We get our word waffle today from the democratization of the wafer that was in church, leaving the walls of the church to go become a cool food, which was not initially, I have to admit, a breakfast food. The waffle was initially just a sweetened cracker that could be eaten, found at the market. Usually, again, as it started out, it was a holiday thing, so you would get a special thing in church, but then as you left the church, you could almost get a commemorable but secular version of it. And then they expanded, and one of the first things they did upon expanding was to say, you know, we don't have to have it be so thin, right? We could add a leavening agent of some sort, or just a little baking soda or baking powder or egg or anything, egg whites beaten, to get it to fluff up a little bit. Credit where credit's due. The Belgians were one of the innovators. I want to make sure that they get their credit in all this story. But the waffle then initially has all sorts of different designs to it too. It's only later on that we settle on this pattern, this check-marked pattern. Eventually the waffle comes to America, which is, of course, where any good story should really truly begin, is with America. And in America, what did we do? We added maple syrup to the waffle. This is where the story really takes off, but not in the way you think, because New Englanders were the first to add maple syrup to just about everything. Why did they do this? They did this in protest. Wherever New Englanders could sweeten with maple syrup, it meant that they were protesting and they were boycotting slavery. This meant that molasses from the East Indies wasn't being used. This meant that sugarcane that was used and was grown in tropical areas by slave labor, those things were done away with, and good old-fashioned hard work, a maple tree, and a whole lot of boiling was instead what you relied on. And therefore the waffle is now firmly entangled also in the struggle for liberation, and incidentally shows up as a key food in soul food as well. Who would have known? The waffle. Lastly, where we get is New York City around the Gilded Age, and young men of all stripes are having what they call waffle parties. Yes, waffle parties. Again, a very democratic institution, but also very highborn. The idea of a waffle party was people would rotate their turn on what that point in time was the electric waffle maker. Really the pinnacle of waffle technology. We have not yet surpassed it. The next thing I'm sure will come along, but right now the electric waffle maker is peak waffling. Now everyone would have a chance on the waffles so that the other people could eat the waffles. A huge amount of waffles were consumed. And the papers, like many things that young men, young dandies do, decried the waffle parties. They said that they were a disgusting show of exuberance. People overate. It was nothing at all anyway, like the story going all the way back to Jesus' disciples and their little gathering centered around the wafer, the unleavened piece of wafer. There was a version of this sermon I could have preached years ago that would have said, "We have all gone the way of the waffle." The thing that was special and holy, this gathering, this church gathering, this is the Sunday or the Thursday where we talk about how good it is that we have community, and we have watched it walk away from us out into the secular world, right? We have lost control of our wafer, and it's become a waffle, and people are out there having waffle parties instead of doing what they really ought to do, right? They should get their butts in their pews, and they should come here and enjoy the fellowship that we have to share. I don't preach that sermon anymore. I don't preach that sermon anymore because it's not happening out there in the world either. And that's the real tragedy. The real tragedy is that we are in the midst of what has been called a loneliness epidemic. Whereas once we might have said, it sure is too bad that we have competition in terms of the companionship that we can offer, the true tragedy is now I have fewer and fewer places where I can point to where other people are going to be seen and to be recognized, to talk to one another, to have a chat, to have normal human interaction. And this is a crisis that has legitimate medical backing. We're seeing doctors and people calling this thing something that has clear ramifications for the health and well-being of our society and for individuals, for many, many things. So what I have to offer today is twofold. I have to say, I love Maundy, Thursday because we have a very, very low bar. If 12 of us get together, we're doing as well as Jesus did tonight, okay? That's fine. And I kind of like the fact that it's the one church service where we're not panicking about trying to bolster numbers. We're not thinking to ourselves about how do we get enough people in here. This is a celebration of who is here. And, yep, it's the regulars. Yep, it's the folks who have put in so much effort and made this place always be what it is. And it's a celebration of you. And yes, this service and this sermon will end in the way that we always do, which is to say we do have a responsibility to offer it to the rest of the world too, for them to hear about the kind of fellowship, the kind of gathering, the kind of wafer, and the kind of washing that we offer here, all of the above. But this is a year that I want to put a punctuation mark on the end of that message, because I want you to know that we're not eating wafers and we're not having waffle parties either. It is an awfully dark world out there filled with a lot of people who don't know where to turn or who they can talk to.